They said I must have lost my mind, leaving everything, $6.3 million of my own hard-earned, long-earned, quietly saved life, to a cat, my cat. This is a joke, right? A clerical mistake. Mom, tell them you didn't mean that. That was the first thing out of my eldest son's mouth. Not even a good morning. Not even a glance to see whether I was breathing or bleeding or shaking. Just outrage, pure and sharp. The kind that comes only from people who believe the world was built to serve them, and that any deviation from that order is a personal attack. But what truly sliced me open was the moment after, when he leaned toward the lawyer and whispered, loud enough that his sister could hear, soft enough that he thought I couldn't. She's too old to know what she's doing. We'll contest it. The money stays in the family. In the family, as if I were not the origin of the family they claimed to defend, as if I were an inconvenient appendage, a dried branch on a tree they were already planning to prune. I sat there in that polished conference room, the kind with glass walls and leather chairs that squeak when someone shifts with entitlement, and I felt something inside me go still. Not break, no. Breaking implies some kind of dramatic sound, a crack, a gasp, a collapse. This was quieter. It was the hush of recognition, the slow settling of truth, the acceptance of something I had known for a very long time, but had refused to face head on. They had not come for me, not for my well-being, not for any remnant of the tenderness I once believed lived in them. They had come for the numbers printed on the pages in that folder, the ones the lawyer read in a flat, steady voice, while they clutched their phones like weapons and traded glances sharp enough to cut glass. You may wonder why a woman my age, with joints that complain every morning like old wooden stairs and a heart that sometimes hesitates before beating, would choose to leave everything to a cat. But the truth is, the choice wasn't strange at all. Mikkel is the only creature who never walked past me, never dismissed my existence as an afterthought, never treated my presence as something to apologize for. He's 14 years old, with fur the color of cooling ash and eyes that still widen, with the same trust he showed the day he followed me home from the neighbor's porch. When my husband died, when the house fell silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional creak in the attic, Mikkel came and pressed his small weight against my chest as if to say, I'm still here. You are not alone. I, children, on the other hand, came only with requests. Could I watch the kids? Could I loan $5,000 just until Friday? Could I sign this paper? Could I take this package? Could I say yes one more time? Could I continue being convenient? Could I stay quiet? So when the lawyer finished speaking, when he folded the documents with more care than any of my children had shown me in years, I sat there with my hands clasped in my lap, watching my daughter's mouth form the familiar, elegant shape of outrage. She looked at me as if seeing a stranger, or worse, as if seeing a malfunctioning appliance, something that must be fixed, reset, corrected. Mom, why would you do this? Why would you embarrass us like this? Embarrass them, as if my private wishes for my own belongings were an attack on their reputations. My daughter has always cared more for appearances than for people, and I suppose I shouldn't blame her for it entirely. She grew up in a world that taught her the value of the polished surface, the curated smile, the swift erasure of anything, imperfect or inconvenient. But I could have said the things that had brewed inside me for years. The lonely holidays, the cold birthdays, the rushed phone calls where they kept one eye on the clock, the way they stopped asking what I loved or how I slept or whether I ever felt afraid at night. I could have told them how many times I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, sipping lukewarm tea and staring at the dim outline of Mikkel curled in his basket, wondering how it was possible to feel more at home with a creature that could not speak than with children who shared my blood. I could have listed the decades of quiet sacrifices that no one ever remembered, the meals I cooked when I was tired enough to drop, the money I loaned even when it stretched me thin, the rides I gave, the favors I never asked to have returned. But explanations require a listener, and my children do not listen. They wait. They wait for their turn to object, to correct, to redirect the spotlight back to themselves. So instead of explaining, I simply sat there and let the storm swirl around me, a storm I had seen coming for years. When the lawyer closed the folder and stood, signaling the end of the meeting, my children were still arguing, not with him, not even truly with me. They were arguing with the idea of losing control, losing access, losing what they believed was theirs by default. They didn't look at me as they gathered their things. My daughter brushed past me without so much as a touch on my shoulder, and my son muttered something about doing what needs to be done into his phone, and then they were gone, leaving behind the faint scent of perfume and cologne, and a silence that settled over the room like settling dust. I sat there for another few minutes, running my fingers slowly along the smooth edge of the table, feeling the faint tremor of age in my hands. The lawyer asked if I needed a ride home. I told him no. I told him I wanted to walk, and so I did. I walked slowly down the street, past the manicured hedges and the shiny storefronts, feeling the sun touch the back of my neck, feeling the strange calm that comes when a truth finally lands in you and stops pretending to be anything else. I walked until the ache in my knees forced me to stop. I sat on a bench, the wood warm beneath me, and thought, I have lived 8 decades on this earth, and only now do I feel the air of my own freedom. I went home to Mikel, who greeted me with a small, expectant chirp, unaware of the drama unfolding around his name. I knelt down, slowly, painfully, and scratched the soft spot between his ears. He leaned into my hand, trusting as always. And in that simple gesture, so small it could be missed by anyone not looking closely, I understood something. Love is not measured in blood or obligation or shared last names. Love is measured in presence, in small consistencies, in the tenderness that asks for nothing back. My children have not been present for a very long time. My cat has never once left. So yes, they were right about one thing. Something in me has changed. But it wasn't madness, it was clarity, delivered at last. They told me the fall wasn't suspicious, that cats, especially old ones like Mikel, tend to slip on tile floors, that sometimes they misjudge a jump or stumble while stretching in the sun. But I knew the way a mother knows when her child lies. I knew the way a woman knows when a lifetime of intuition finally has something solid to hold on to. Because when I found him that night, lying in a crooked shadow under the kitchen sink, with his breath moving in those tiny, terrified shivers, he didn't look like he had slipped. He looked like he had been poisoned by silence, by intention, by hands that didn't love him and never would. I knelt beside him, the cold tiles pressing through the thin fabric of my house dress, and I could smell it, an unfamiliar bitter scent that wasn't his food and wasn't from anything I kept in the house. His tongue was dry. His paws twitched like he was fighting something I couldn't see, and when I touched him, he forced his eyes open and looked at me with the kind of apology animals give when they think they failed you somehow, even as they are the ones being harmed. I whispered his name over and over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely lift him. But I did, because I had carried much heavier things in my life. My husband when he was too weak to stand. My son's shame when he refused to carry it himself. Every burden that motherhood ever demanded of me. Carrying 10 pounds of trembling fur was nothing compared to that. I wrapped Mikkel in the blanket he always slept on and rushed him to the emergency vet, and the whole drive there, my mind swirled with thoughts I had tried to bury for years. My children had always been restless around him. They said he shed too much, scratched their clothes, made the house smell like old lady. They never saw him as anything more than an inconvenience, just like they saw me. The vet asked what had happened, and I told him I didn't know, because at that moment, I didn't trust my own suspicion enough to say it out loud. Not until I heard a professional say something that could anchor my fear. He examined Mikkel for a long time, moving carefully, murmuring technical things to the nurse, and finally he looked up at me with that steady, neutral expression doctors use when they don't want to alarm you. He said the symptoms were consistent with ingesting something that wasn't meant for animals, possibly medication or a household toxin. I asked if it could have been an accident, and he paused a little too long before replying that anything was possible. But the concentration suggested direct contact. Direct contact. Those were his words. And suddenly the image of the pill blister I'd found earlier that morning, the one that had been on the counter now crushed near the trash bin, came back with a clarity that made my stomach twist. My heart didn't break. It clenched, the way a fist does when it is preparing to hold on to something fierce. I brought him home with instructions, tiny syringes for administering water, and a round of soft food that smelled like something I would never eat, but that he nibbled at with slow determination. I sat on the kitchen floor beside him long after midnight, listening to the house creak and sigh like it knew my thoughts and was too afraid to echo them aloud. It wasn't until I stood to make tea, feeling the stiffness in my knees and the sting of the cold tiles, that I saw it. The back door latch slightly lifted, not enough to open, not enough for a draft, but enough for someone who knew how it worked, enough for someone who had been there recently, who had touched it, who had checked it. My son had used that door earlier that day when he came just to talk, the same son who had glared at the trust documents like they were weapons pointed at him, the same son who once told me, half joking but with an undercurrent I had chosen to ignore, that he didn't understand the point of spending so much money on an animal that would die soon anyway. I pushed the latch down slowly, carefully, and the click it made felt like the punctuation mark on a sentence I didn't want to read. The next morning, I called both of my children. Neither answered. My daughter texted 5 hours later, claiming she had been at brunch. My son responded with a thumbs-up emoji, the kind people use when they want to end a conversation before it begins. I didn't tell them about Mikkel. I didn't tell them about the vet. I didn't tell them about the latch. Some truths must be held close until they finish forming. Instead, I sat with my coffee, watching the light crawl across the kitchen table, feeling a strange mixture of grief and calm. It was the calm that frightened me more. Calm meant acceptance. Calm meant I understood the truth even before it announced itself fully. Later that afternoon, when the house felt too quiet and my thoughts too loud, I turned on the small security monitor I had installed years ago, the one my son told me was paranoid and unnecessary, because who would ever break into an old woman's house? I had almost forgotten it existed. I scrolled through the footage, and for a moment all I saw were the comforting, mundane scenes of my own life. Me shuffling into the kitchen for tea, me watering the plants, Mikkel stretching luxuriously on the rug. But then, around 9:47 p.m., from 2 nights earlier, the night before the will reading, I froze. A figure entered through the back door, not forced, not hurried, with a key, a silhouette that moved with the same careful impatience my son had since he was young, the same stiff shoulders, the same way of pausing before crossing a threshold. He walked straight to the counter, opened a cabinet he should not have remembered, and pulled something out, a bottle, one of my medications. He unscrewed it casually, as if it were mouthwash, and tipped a few pills into his palm. Then he put the bottle back, the wrong way, label facing inward. He exited the same way he came in, calm, certain, unchallenged. I watched that footage 4 times, each time waiting for some detail that might absolve him, some frame that would reveal a misunderstanding, a coincidence, an innocent explanation. None came. The truth stood bare and unapologetic. My own child, my son, the one I had carried for 9 months and raised through fevers and heartbreaks and scraped knees, had entered my home and touched things that were never meant for him, with intentions that were never loving, and I felt a kind of sorrow I didn't know existed. Not the sorrow of loss, but the sorrow of revelation, the sorrow of seeing a familiar face become unfamiliar, the sorrow of realizing that the threat doesn't always come from outside the door. Sometimes it comes wearing your child's smile. I sat there in the dim kitchen, the security screen still glowing, Mikel curled weakly against my leg, and I understood that this was not about money anymore. It never had been. This was about control, about entitlement, about the way certain people believe the world should bend for them and will break anything that stands in the way, even if that anything is the frail, soft creature their mother loves more than her own failing breath. That night became the dividing line in my life, the moment when I stopped telling myself comforting lies and started seeing my children with unvarnished eyes. And once clarity enters a room, it never leaves the same way it came in. It settles, it expands, it fills the corners. I stroked Mikel's fur, feeling the faint rise and fall of his breath, and whispered to him that we were not alone, not anymore, not in the way that mattered. I told him that something had awakened in me, something I had let sleep far too long, the part of me that protects, the part of me that fights quietly but thoroughly, the part of me that remembers whose life, whose home, whose choices these truly are. That was the night I began to prepare, not for confrontation, but for truth, and for the inevitable storm truth brings with it. And as I carried Mikel to bed, wrapping him gently against my chest, I realized that for the first time in years, I was no longer afraid of my children. I was afraid for them, for what they had already done to their own souls. In the days that followed, something in the house shifted in a way that wasn't loud or dramatic, but unmistakable, like the subtle change in air pressure before a storm. Nothing broke, nothing fell, no one shouted, no doors slammed, yet every corner carried a new tension, a stretched, tight waiting. I moved more slowly, not because age demanded it, but because I was listening, noticing, measuring the quiet with a kind of sharpening I hadn't felt in years. It is a strange thing to realize that you are bracing not for strangers or accidents or the cruelties of the world, but for the people you once nursed through their nightmares. It is even stranger to discover that the moment you stop denying what stands in front of you, the entire architecture of your life rearranges itself. Doors you once trusted now look fragile. Faces you once adored now seem carved from unfamiliar stone. Even the sound of your own heartbeat feels different, steadier, more deliberate. Mikel grew stronger, little by little, his steps returning with that quiet dignity cats possess even when they are weak. But he stayed close to me in a way he never had before. He followed me from room to room, not clingy, just watchful, as though he too sensed an invisible ripple beneath the calm. His recovery eased my dread, but it also sharpened my awareness, because every movement he made, every flick of his ears toward the back door, reminded me of what almost happened, and how easily it could happen again if I allowed myself to drift back into old habits of trust. So I didn't drift. I stayed alert, and in doing so, I began to notice things I had ignored before, small things that spoke louder than any outburst. My children began showing up more often, always unannounced, always pretending surprise when they found me home, as if I had anywhere else to be. My daughter would appear with a box of pastries I didn't like, calling it a treat, her eyes scanning the kitchen counters with quick, assessing flickers. She never stayed long, never sat for tea, never asked about the weather or my health or my sleep. She moved through the rooms like someone checking inventory. My son, on the other hand, arrived with a heavy, falsely affectionate energy that made the air around him feel thick. He would stand by the doorway, arms crossed, pretending concern, asking if I felt lonely, asking if I had considered downsizing like other people my age, and suggesting, so casually, so carelessly, that an old house like mine had become too much responsibility for one person. He said the word responsibility the way someone says mold or debt, something unpleasant, something shameful. But it wasn't his tone that alarmed me. It was the way he walked through the house without asking, opening cupboards as if he'd misplaced something, glancing at the medicine shelf a beat too long, letting a strange, polite silence follow every question. When he left, he always said, "Take care, Mom." But he said it with the cadence of someone delivering a warning rather than a wish. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Age can make suspicion feel dangerously natural, and I didn't want to become the kind of woman who sees danger in every shadow. But then the shadows began to shift in ways I couldn't ignore. One morning, I found the back door unlocked, though I had checked it twice the night before. Another day, the cabinet where I kept Mikel's food stood slightly ajar, not enough to be obvious, just enough to suggest a hand unfamiliar with the way it sticks at the top. Once I found my set of spare keys, moved from their place inside the ceramic bowl on the mantel to the drawer near the fridge, and I knew I hadn't touched them. These were not accidents. These were tests, small, careful, almost polite intrusions meant to feel deniable, things that could be blamed on forgetfulness, on age, on confusion, the sorts of things people whisper about when they want to build a case for taking over someone else's life for their own good. I began checking the cameras every night, sometimes twice, and the footage never showed anything dramatic, nothing as blatant as the last time. But it showed patterns. My son's car driving slowly past the house at odd hours, my daughter's silhouette lingering by the mailbox longer than necessary, the faint glint of someone looking through the yard from the street. They weren't hiding, not really, but they weren't visiting either. They were orbiting, circling like people trying to decide the safest way to approach something they feared might explode. Meanwhile, the conversations grew stranger. My daughter called 3 evenings in a row, each time asking the same question phrased differently. Whether I trusted myself with my medication schedule, whether I ever forgot to lock the doors, whether I felt overwhelmed. She said the last word, gently, like one might offer a blanket, but it landed like a net. My son, too, began speaking in softened, half-accusations, telling me stories about elderly patients he'd heard of who became confused, who hurt themselves without meaning to, who made irrational decisions during stressful times. He referred to my will as a rough draft, a temporary mistake, a legal hiccup that could surely be fixed once I was thinking clearly again. Hearing my own child suggest that my lucidity was negotiable made something cold settle beneath my ribs. What made it worse was that they did all of this with politeness. Not cruelty, not yelling, not threats, just smooth, polished manners that made every sentence sound reasonable, even as the meaning pulsed with menace. Polite harm is the most insidious kind. It gives you nothing to point to when someone asks what's wrong, because all you can say is that their tone felt like a knife wrapped in velvet. In response, I began taking small precautions. I changed the code on the back door. I moved the spare keys to a place only I knew. I stored my medication in a locked box, not because I feared forgetting, but because I feared remembering too late that someone else had been near it. I reorganized the kitchen, not for efficiency, but so I would know immediately if anything had been moved. Each night before bed, I made a slow tour through the house, touching every latch, every window, every light switch, letting my fingertips memorize the exact position of each object. It felt obsessive at first, but it quickly became ritual, the way lighting candles might be for another woman, a gesture that said, "I am here, I am aware, I am not the one slipping." The deeper truth is that I was not afraid of them in the way people imagine, afraid of being hurt or shouted at or robbed. I was afraid of being erased, afraid of becoming a story they told about the poor, confused old woman who didn't know what she was doing, afraid of being rewritten as a problem to be solved instead of a person who had lived, chosen, loved, and lost on her own terms. It is a terrible thing to realize your children have begun narrating your life in the past tense while you are still breathing. And then, as if all of this subtle erosion weren't enough, the phone calls from acquaintances began. Friends of my daughter, distant relatives, people I hadn't heard from in years, suddenly wanted to check in on me. They asked gentle, insinuating questions about my health, about my clarity, about whether I had support, and I could hear my children's voices echoing behind their words. They were building a scaffolding, a quiet, polite scaffolding, constructing the outline of a story in which I was fragile, confused, irresponsible, and in need of guidance. They weren't trying to help me. They were preparing the world to believe them. But the strangest, most telling moment came one afternoon when my son stopped by without warning, pretending to bring groceries. He set the bag on the counter, smiled too brightly, and said my name, not Mom, with the careful enunciation of someone attempting to soothe an unpredictable animal. He looked. The window, he had once said, was dangerously low. The window that faced the driveway. The window he knew I sometimes forgot to close on warm nights. That was when I realized something essential. They weren't escalating because they wanted the money. They were escalating because I had disrupted the story they believed they were entitled to live. The story where everything they expected would simply fall into place, where their mother would remain obedient, grateful, pliable. I had broken the script, and people rarely forgive those who refuse to play the roles assigned to them. I woke the next morning feeling the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from a decision forming quietly in the marrow, a slow, deliberate turning of the inner tide. Nothing dramatic had happened overnight. No new footprints at the back door, no strange noises, no shadows crossing the hallway. But my mind had crossed a line, and once a mind like mine crosses a line, it never returns the same way. I realized that waiting for the next intrusion, the next polite manipulation, the next disguised threat was no longer a life I was willing to inhabit. There comes a moment, late in a woman's years, when survival stops being a passive act and becomes something intentional, nearly ceremonial, like sharpening a blade not for battle, but for dignity. I understood that if I didn't act now, if I didn't reclaim even a small corner of control, I would spend the rest of my days not living, but anticipating the next attempt to fold me back into obedience. And I had been obedient for far too long. The shift didn't announce itself with anger or tears. It arrived in the most mundane of gestures. I opened the cabinet under the sink to refill the dish soap and saw the small pile of old cleaning rags. They were folded neatly, the way I have always kept them, but the sight of them stirred something in me, like they were relics of a woman who used to smooth surfaces, erase messes, make things easier for everyone else. I realized I no longer wanted to be a cloth that wiped away other people's guilt. I wanted to be the surface that showed the smear, the mark, the truth. That thought, simple as it was, settled in my bones like a new kind of gravity. I closed the cabinet door, slower than usual, and stood there for a moment, letting my breath catch up to my body. When I turned, I noticed Mikkel watching me from the threshold, his tail curled around his paws. His eyes were clearer now, the fog of his near poisoning finally lifting, and in them I saw a steadiness I hadn't seen in myself for years. It struck me suddenly that he had survived not out of luck, but out of sheer will, that even in his weakened state, he had chosen to stay alive because my presence meant something to him. That realization, more than any document or camera footage, ignited a spark I hadn't felt since my youth. A low, determined warmth that reminded me of who I had once been before I softened myself into the predictable shape of motherhood. I knelt, scratched behind his ears, and whispered that we were done waiting. He blinked at me slowly, and I took it as agreement. The first thing I did was gather every medication I owned and place it into a small lockbox I hadn't touched in years, one that still smelled faintly of my husband's cologne. I didn't lock it because I feared an accident. I locked it because I now understood that the real danger comes when others believe your survival is negotiable. Then I opened the drawer where I kept the security system manual, dusted off the cover, and read through every page with the sharp, focused attention of a much younger woman. I upgraded the settings, added motion alerts, repositioned the cameras so nothing, not a hand, not a shadow, not a glance, could slip past unnoticed. I changed passwords, created decoys, programmed silent notifications. I did it slowly, deliberately, and with a kind of reverence, as if I were stitching together a cloak of protection I should have worn long ago. But the real turning point came when I decided to leave the house. Not escape, not flee, just leave long enough to breathe air that didn't carry the imprint of my children's intentions. I dressed in my navy cardigan, the one that still held its shape, and took Mikkel's favorite blanket to place near his basket so he wouldn't feel abandoned. Then I stepped out into the afternoon sun and walked with purpose, not toward town, not toward a neighbor, but toward the small office plaza 2 blocks over where my lawyer worked. I hadn't planned on speaking with him again so soon after the will reading, but the thought of that empty conference room, the same one where my children had muttered their entitlement beneath their breath, filled me with a strange, bracing energy. I wanted to sit in that room once more, but this time without their voices, their expectations, their rehearsed performances of sorrow. The lawyer greeted me with mild surprise, asked if everything was all right, and I told him the truth in the softest possible version. I didn't mention my son entering the house at night, or the crushed pill blister on the floor. I simply told him I wanted to ensure that my estate was structured in a way that no one, no matter how determined, could challenge my decisions under the excuse of age or mental decline. He didn't question me. Perhaps he saw something in my expression, something steady and cold and unmistakably resolved. He explained my options, some of which I had never heard of despite decades of careful living. A tighter trust structure, a secondary executor, a notarized statement confirming my mental soundness, protective clauses that would make contesting the will nearly impossible. I listened, nodded, and signed my name with a firmness I hadn't felt in years. Each letter felt like a thread in a rope I was finally learning to pull. When I left his office, I didn't go straight home. I walked slowly through the neighborhood, observing the world with new eyes. I saw the way the breeze shifted the branches of the old oak by the bus stop, the way the sunlight caught the dust motes in front of the bakery window, the way people moved, careless, unburdened, unaware of how heavy life can feel when the danger doesn't come from outside, but from the very people you once swaddled against the cold. For the first time in months, I felt as though I was inhabiting my body instead of hiding inside it. I even stopped at the small grocery store on the corner and bought myself a jar of honey and a loaf of fresh bread, simple comforts that reminded me of mornings long before my children learned to twist kindness into currency. When I returned home, I paused at the doorstep. The house looked the same as always, quiet, modest, a little crooked at the foundation, but I felt different. I felt like I was walking back, not as a woman waiting for harm, but as a woman preparing for whatever would come next. Inside, Mikhail lifted his head and let out a soft trill, and I told him, gently but firmly, that things were going to change, that from now on we would act instead of react. I brewed tea, not out of ritual, but out of celebration, a small private acknowledgement that I had taken the first step toward reclaiming the ground beneath my own feet. Later that night, when the house was still and the only sound was Mikhail's steady breathing, I sat at the kitchen table and realized that fear had loosened its hold on me. Not vanished. Fear never fully leaves an old woman, but loosened, like a hand unclenching its grip. I felt something else rising in its place, something long forgotten. Agency, the sense that I could shape my own hours instead of letting them be shaped by the quiet calculations of others. I didn't know exactly what would happen next, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done being a passive witness in my own life. I was stepping into the center, into the place where decisions are made, even if it meant stepping alone. And in that quiet, with the night pressing gently against the windows, I felt a flicker of anticipation that surprised me. For the first time in a long time, the future did not feel like a threat. It felt like a door I had just learned to unlock. The first sign that the past had begun circling back toward me came in the form of a letter slipped through my mail slot on a bright, indifferent morning when the world outside looked too calm for anything dangerous to be approaching. I recognized my grandson's handwriting instantly, those long, looping letters that always leaned a little too far to the right, the way he used to lean into me when he was a small boy, fearful of loud noises. The sight of his name pulled at something soft inside me, something I hadn't allowed to surface in months, and for a moment I considered not opening it at all, because I already sensed it wasn't simply a greeting. It was a signal, a tremor ahead of the quake. When I unfolded the paper and saw the message, short, trembling around the edges, I felt my heart shift painfully. He wrote that his parents were talking about me in worried voices, that they were whispering late at night about next steps and getting ahead of the situation and intervening before anything irreversible happens. He said they were fighting more than usual, slamming doors, blaming each other for not handling me correctly. And then, in a line so soft I had to bring the page closer to the window, he wrote that he missed me, that he didn't believe anything they were saying, that he knew I was not confused, not fragile, not slipping into the sort of decline they were describing. He asked me to be careful. That warning, coming from the gentlest member of my bloodline, was the moment I realized my children were no longer merely circling. They were preparing to strike. After that letter, the intrusions became bolder in a way that felt deliberate, as if they had stopped trying to hide the pressure and begun positioning themselves openly, convinced I wouldn't have the strength to confront them. My daughter arrived one afternoon without knocking, sweeping into the kitchen with a large tote bag, as though she expected to find me collapsed on the floor or wandering the hallway, muttering nonsense. She stood in the doorway studying me with an assessing gaze, as if counting the wrinkles on my face or measuring the steadiness of my hands. Without asking permission, she began cleaning, rearranging, discarding items she claimed were old, unsafe, or too much for me now, piling them into her bag with the entitled efficiency of someone accustomed to taking what she decides is unnecessary. When I asked her to stop, she didn't respond immediately. She simply tightened her jaw and continued folding my towels into harsh, sterile rectangles. Only after several minutes did she say in a clipped tone that she was helping, that I had always been stubborn, that I should be grateful someone still cared enough to monitor the state of my home. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Instead, I told her calmly that I no longer needed help I hadn't asked for. Her smile, thin and trembling, told me she was offended, not by my words, but by my autonomy. Then came my son, 2 days later, arriving just before dusk with an expression of strained patience. He walked through my living room slowly, touching furniture, trailing his fingers along surfaces, speaking in that careful, measured tone therapists use with volatile clients. He commented on the lighting, on the temperature, on the number of steps leading to my porch, each remark phrased as concern, but weighted with accusation. Finally, he sighed dramatically and told me he had been researching options for people in my situation, places with full-time supervision, medical staff, structure, safety. He listed them as if reciting blessings, his voice soft, coaxing, manipulative. I stood there listening, and for the first time in years, I saw my son not as the boy I had raised, but as the man he had become, a man shaped by entitlement, hardened by expectation, softened only by convenience. When I told him firmly that I wasn't going anywhere, that this conversation was inappropriate and premature, he let the mask slip for just a moment. His face tightened, his eyes sharpened, and in a voice that contained no warmth at all, he told me that I wasn't thinking clearly, that I was making things harder than they needed to be, that the family was at a breaking point because of my behavior. As if my independence were a tantrum. The visits didn't stop. They came more frequently, sometimes together, sometimes apart, each one heavier than the last, each one thick with tension disguised as concern. They began leaving pamphlets on my counter, brochures for retirement facilities, legal outlines for conservatorships, articles about dementia. They asked probing questions about my finances, my routines, my sleep, and every answer I gave was met with a look that said they would cross-check it later. They began photographing things in my house, lamp positions, open drawers, the arrangement of my pantry, and when I finally asked why, my daughter said she was documenting my decline. Decline. The word slid into my ears like oil. It dawned on me then that they were building a dossier, preparing material, compiling a narrative in which I was no longer competent enough to control my own life. A narrative they would present to lawyers, perhaps even to a judge, all under the generous guise of concern. The day the pressure crescendoed came unexpectedly, on an afternoon saturated with the thick heat of late summer. I had gone to the pharmacy for my prescription refill, taking the long route home to enjoy the fading magnolia blossoms near the park. When I approached my street, I saw my daughter's car parked in my driveway and my son standing near my front steps with a locksmith whose truck announced emergency access services. My pulse began to drum in my throat, not with panic, but with a cold gathering clarity. They had brought a locksmith to my home, to change the locks without my knowledge, without my permission, without even the courtesy of pretending this was anything other than an attempted takeover. I walked toward them steadily, refusing to speed up, refusing to break the illusion that I still controlled the pace. When my son noticed me, he flashed a rehearsed smile and said they were trying to ensure my safety, that they believed it best if they held the keys for now, that too many sets of keys could lead to confusion or loss. The locksmith, clearly uncomfortable, asked me directly whether I had authorized the service, and when I said no, he stepped back immediately, apologizing profusely. My children's faces hardened in synchrony, their disappointment visible, their plan disrupted. My daughter stepped forward, her hand hovering near my arm as if she might restrain me, and in a brittle voice she said that I was overreacting, that they were only trying to help, that I was forcing their hand. Forcing their hand, what a revealing phrase. I told the locksmith calmly that he needed to leave. He did. My children lingered, insisting, arguing, growing more frantic as they realized I wasn't bending, wasn't wavering, wasn't stepping into the role of the helpless matriarch they had already cast for me. My son raised his voice, accusing me of putting them in an impossible position, of creating unnecessary conflict, of jeopardizing the family's future. My daughter cried, a thin, theatrical sound, asking why I no longer trusted them. I didn't engage. I simply walked past them, unlocked my door, and closed it behind me, leaving them outside with their arguments unfinished. Through the window, I saw them standing in the driveway, gesturing angrily at each other, their unity cracking now that the target of their shared purpose had denied them. After that incident, the air around my home seemed to tighten, as though the walls themselves were aware of the threat encroaching from the people who once lived within them. The phone calls increased, voicemails filled with concern laced with impatience, texts demanding answers, emails asking me to reconsider my decisions. They complained that I was shutting them out, that I was making things harder, that they were simply trying to take care of matters before they escalate. I laughed when I read that phrase, because they had no idea how much had already escalated. Inside me, how their every attempt to seize control only strengthened my conviction that I must hold my ground, not only for myself, but for the quiet dignity of every woman who has ever been dismissed as fragile simply because she has lived long. Enough to accumulate wrinkles. The moment that sealed my understanding came one evening when I reviewed the security footage, a habit I had adopted not out of fear, but out of discipline. That night, as the footage played in its silent grayscale loop, I saw my daughter's silhouette standing at my back gate long after dark, lingering, hesitating, her face partially illuminated by the faint glow of her phone. She wasn't visiting. She wasn't checking on me. She was surveying, plotting, calculating, perhaps rehearsing the kind of story she would eventually tell to justify whatever she intended to do next. She stayed there for nearly 6 minutes, unmoving, staring at my house like someone studying the perimeter of a fortress. That image, cold and unwavering, sank into me deeper than the footage of my son taking the pills had. It told me that this wasn't a misunderstanding or an accident or a burst of panic. It was a campaign, and I was the battlefield. I closed the laptop, exhaled slowly, and realized something profound. They were afraid, not of my frailty or confusion, but of my clarity. They were afraid of a mother who would no longer play dead, so they could divide the spoils. They were afraid of a woman who had stopped apologizing for her own existence. They were afraid because for the first time in their lives, I had something they could not control: my will, my voice, my choices. And once I understood their fear, mine evaporated like mist. The evening they finally came was one of those strangely calm nights when the air feels heavy, but still, as though the world itself is holding its breath to witness something it knows cannot be undone. Mikel lay curled beside me on the sofa, his breathing soft and steady, and every so often his ears twitched toward the window as if he too sensed a shift approaching. I watched the fading light stretch across the room and thought about all the years I had given to being gentle, compliant, patient, forgiving, and how those virtues had been mistaken for weakness by the very people I had raised. It struck me that love, when given without boundaries, becomes a language others learn to twist. Just after 9, headlights swept across my living room wall, a slow, confident sweep that told me immediately it wasn't a neighbor or a stranger. It was the kind of arrival made by people who believe they have the right to enter a home uninvited because they've rehearsed a story in which their intrusion is a rescue. I muted the television, smoothed my cardigan, and stood up with the kind of steadiness that comes only when fear has been burned down to its embers. When the knock came, sharp, too loud, too insistent, I let it echo once before walking toward the door. My children stood there, their faces tight with a determination so brittle it was almost translucent. My daughter clutched a stack of papers, and my son held a manila folder tucked under his arm like a weapon disguised as bureaucracy. Their eyes darted past me into the house, searching for signs of disorder, any clue that could justify what they were about to say. My daughter spoke first, her voice coated with false warmth that cracked at the edges. She said they needed to talk, that they had made a difficult decision, that things had gone too far, and that it was time to intervene before the situation spiraled out of control. Her choice of words was deliberate, rehearsed, chosen not for me, but for the record she planned to build afterward. My son stepped inside without waiting for my invitation, brushing past me in a way that felt less like impatience and more like possession. He said they had consulted professionals, that they had received advice, that the combination of my recent irrational behavior, my paranoia, and my dangerous choices regarding the will left them no choice but to request a medical evaluation and begin the legal process of obtaining temporary authority over my affairs. Temporary authority. How politely he named the theft he intended. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The danger came not from volume, but from certainty. My daughter handed me the papers. They were filled with statements they had prepared, claims of confusion, hints at instability, carefully worded insinuations that I had grown unable to manage my life. And in those pages, I saw not just their betrayal, but the full measure of their belief that I would break under the weight of their pressure, that I would plead or panic or collapse into the image they had painted of me. I didn't speak, not at first. I simply walked to the coffee table, set the papers down carefully, and reached for the remote to turn on the television. Not the channel, but the small device that connected to the security system. As the screen flickered to life, their expressions shifted. My son's jaw tightened, my daughter's eyes narrowed, and in that moment I knew they understood that something had been set in motion beyond their control. Without a word, I opened the file of recorded footage. I played the clip of my son entering the house at night, moving straight toward my medication cabinet, tilting pills into his palm with the ease of someone who believed they were invisible. I didn't speak while the video played. I didn't need to. The silence between us grew dense, almost suffocating, as the evidence of his actions flickered across the room. My daughter gasped and covered her mouth, not out of horror at the act, but out of horror at being caught in a plan that now had a visible trail. Before either of them could speak, I opened the next clip, the one showing my daughter at the back gate late at night, her posture tense, her expression concentrated, her phone held like a flashlight of intent. I let the footage play in full, letting every second etch itself into their awareness. The room felt heavy with truth, thick with the unraveling of the narrative they had crafted. When I finally spoke, my voice was low but steady, not shaking, not pleading, simply certain. I told them that I had already taken the footage to my lawyer, that the documents they brought were not only false, but now part of a counter case. I told them I had filed a detailed statement with authorities, outlining the attempted poisoning of my cat, the trespassing, the coercion, the manipulation, the planned conservatorship, and the intention to seize assets under false pretenses. I told them that copies of the footage had been stored off-site and would be automatically shared if anything happened to me. My daughter broke first. Her voice rose in a shrill protest that I was twisting things, that I was making them look like monsters, that she only wanted to help. But even as she spoke, her eyes darted nervously toward the window, as though checking whether a neighbor could hear her unraveling. My son remained silent, his face rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, it was in a thin, strained voice that tried and failed to regain control of the moment. He said, I didn't understand the consequences of what I was doing, that I was risking everything, that I was destroying the family. I told him calmly that they had destroyed the family the moment they chose deceit over honesty, force over conversation, greed over love. I told them that my decisions regarding my estate were final, legally sealed, and now fortified by evidence of their misconduct. I told them that I no longer trusted them in my home, and that from that moment on, if they wished to contact me, it would be through my attorney. My daughter tried to step closer, reaching toward me with a tremor of desperation, but I raised my hand, not aggressively, simply firmly, and she froze. My son cursed under his breath, a small rupture in his carefully maintained composure, and for a brief moment I saw the boy he used to be, the one who once hid behind my legs during thunderstorms. But whatever softness remained in him flickered out almost immediately, replaced by resentment, by wounded pride, by something darker. They left shortly after that, my son dragging my daughter toward the door with a mixture of fury and humiliation. As they stepped outside, I watched them turn back once, both wearing expressions I had never seen on their faces before, a mixture of disbelief, fury, and fear. They walked to their car stiffly, like people moving through the aftermath of an explosion they hadn't expected. When the engine roared to life and their headlights cut across my yard, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Not relief, not triumph, but something quieter, deeper, steadier, reclamation. I closed the door gently, locked it, and leaned against the wood for a long moment, letting the silence settle around me. Mikkel rubbed against my ankle, and I bent to pick him up, holding him against my heart the way I once held my children before they learned to outgrow tenderness. In that quiet room, with the remnants of confrontation still vibrating in the air, I understood fully that what had happened could never be undone. The truth had been spoken, recorded, witnessed. The roles had shifted irrevocably, and I, an old woman with tired bones and a stubborn heart, had reclaimed the last piece of ground that was mine to defend. In the days that followed their departure, a strange gentleness settled over the house, not the softness of forgetting, but the calm that comes when the air is finally cleared of a storm that has been gathering for months. I noticed it first in the morning, when I opened the curtains and realized the light seemed to fall differently, not because the sun had changed, but because I no longer woke expecting intrusion or accusation. My home felt like mine again. The walls no longer straining under the pressure of unspoken threats or the weight of footsteps that entered uninvited. I moved through each room slowly, touching the edges of tables, the backs of chairs, the worn banister by the hallway, reacquainting myself with the quiet intimacy of living alone without the constant anticipation of conflict. Mikkel followed me with a cautious dignity, as though sensing that something significant had shifted, his movements unhurried, his gaze calm and steady. The phone rang several times during that first week, but I let each call drift into voicemail, unwilling to invite their voices back into the fragile peace I had begun to rebuild. The messages were fragmented, uneven, sometimes apologetic, sometimes defensive, sometimes tinged with desperation. My daughter's voice cracked with confusion, insisting she hadn't meant harm, that she only wanted to help, that everything had spiraled out of proportion. My son's voice remained cold and clipped, offering a strained mixture of disappointment and veiled anger, claiming that I had ruined the family's reputation and that someday I would regret my decisions. I listened to none of it in full. I deleted each message with the same steady, deliberate motion, choosing silence over the exhausting cycle of explanation and justification. It felt strange at first, defiant even, to remove myself from their reach. But the longer I stayed quiet, the clearer my mind became, and the more I understood that sometimes peace comes not from reconciliation, but from stepping away. I spent more time outdoors, walking slowly along familiar streets, noticing details I had ignored for years. The faint scent of jasmine that drifted from the neighbor's fence, the way the sky ripened into deeper shades of blue just before sunset, the crisp echo of my steps on the sidewalk. People I had known for decades stopped to greet me, their faces carrying no trace of the drama unfolding inside my family, and it comforted me to realize that my world extended far beyond the narrow frame my children had tried to fit me into. One afternoon, I sat on the bench near the small pond in the park, watching the water shimmer under the soft breeze, and I felt an ease settle into my bones, a reminder that life had once been spacious and could be again, even at my age. It took time for the tension inside me to thaw completely, but little by little, in the quiet rituals of daily life, I found myself breathing more deeply. I woke without dread, cooked meals without wondering who might knock on my door, read books without glancing toward the windows whenever a car slowed outside. I even wrote letters, long, slow letters, to women I had known in my youth, women who had scattered across states and continents, women whose voices I had missed without realizing it. I told them small truths, not everything, just enough to feel the warmth of connection returning. Their replies arrived within days or weeks, full of stories from their own lives, and I found myself smiling at their words, feeling a tenderness that had gone dormant during the months of tension. But the truest moment of resolution came one evening when I sat on the back porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching Mikkel curl into a perfect gray circle at my feet. The sky was beginning to blush with the last traces of daylight, and a hush covered the yard, that lovely expansive quiet that makes the heart feel larger than the body containing it. For the first time since the will reading, I felt completely certain that I had made the right choices, not out of spite or defiance, but out of self-preservation, out of the simple truth that love cannot survive where respect has died. My children had crossed a boundary no apology could mend, and I had finally learned that forgiveness does not require surrender. I thought then of other women, women I have met in waiting rooms or grocery store lines, women whose children speak over them or around them, women who shrink themselves out of habit, women who carry their families' burdens long after those families stop carrying anything for them. I wished I could sit with each of them and tell them what I had learned too late, but thankfully not too late to act on. That there is a kind of power in choosing oneself after a lifetime of choosing others. That aging does not mean erasing oneself, so others may write their own stories over yours. That dignity belongs to anyone brave enough to protect it. The evening deepened slowly, the last light fading behind the fence, and I whispered something to the night. Not quite a prayer, not quite a declaration, but a quiet promise to myself that these remaining years of mine, however many or few, would belong to me and to the small, loyal creature who had never asked for anything but safety and love. I looked at Mikkel, his breathing soft and even, and felt the steady assurance that even the smallest companionship can anchor a life. And so the resolution of this long, bitter chapter came not in triumph or revenge, but in simple, grounded peace, a peace I had carved out of courage I didn't know I still possessed, a peace that came not from winning, but from refusing to be diminished, a peace that, for the first time in far too long, felt like home.